everyone, and thanks once again for joining the podcast. This is Pastor Danny, and you're listening to Elisha's Bears. I want to thank you for listening, of course, and also for following us. If you're not doing that, I would appreciate that a great deal. I'm very excited about our guest today. We have Dr. Greg DeLoach, who is coming to us from Atlanta, Georgia. He is the Dean of the Mercer School of Theology. And Greg, you might have to help me out a little bit. It says here that you were named the interim in 2018, but you were appointed dean in 2021. Am I getting that right?
That's correct. I had a 3-year span where they were reorganizing as a university, and so I weathered that and so forth. Yeah.
Well, like I said, long-time listener, maybe first-time caller as it relates to you. I've been kind of followed your life and career. I knew that you served at First Baptist Church there in Augusta. For about a decade, and I think when I reached out, you were willing to do this. I think the name of the podcast piqued your interest, right? Elisha's Bears. Do you like that story?
I love it. It's a great story. It makes for an interesting sermon. They won't soon forget.
Well, before we got started recording, we were talking about, I'm going to say, a mutual friend with Dr. Walter Sheridan and Buddy Sheridan. He is retired not too far away from here, and I showed you a plaque. I won't do it again, but I was actually, I know you're in Atlanta, but I came down to the school for a sabbatical with Buddy, and it was really, he gave me a reading list, and it was just really transformative for me. This was decades ago. And I'm leading to the question, Greg, are denominations still important? And as far as I'm seeing you laughing already, being a Baptist and those 4 fragile freedoms that Buddy talked about, what's it like being a Baptist these days?
Yeah. And I am laughing, but I do think they still have their place. Like so much, it just continues to evolve. And obviously, or I shouldn't say obviously, but the on-ramp for many in a faith formation experience is no longer denominationally formed, and so we're probably doing as much work of denominationally informing and helping both, and that's, I think, true not simply with students, but I think the average church member. I continue to serve as interims at various congregations. It's the same conversations. Many people are coming into the church not because of the church's middle name, that is their denominational distinctiveness, but because somehow they found a place of belonging, to kind of paraphrase, use some of the language that Diana Butler Bass does in an earlier book. In other words, the belief is not where people are entering into, but the belonging. In theological education, it's also the same, where students are coming from non-denominational backgrounds, or they're coming from a Baptist or Methodist or other context, but they're not sure what that means. And so how do we speak to that with theological precision and affirmation?
Well, kind of growing up as a Baptist, I'm mindful of this, even with my own kids who are in their 20s. They're looking for different things. The denominational brand isn't necessarily the most important thing. I know you've been out of the pastorate for a little while, and I'm just curious, what were some things, and then I guess you're still in and out of the church doing some interims. What are some things, when you look back upon it, what were some things that you enjoyed about being a pastor, and what are some things that you didn't enjoy? And it's okay to name names.
Yeah. Well, the good news is this is kind of true regardless of the particular church I served. I continue to love preaching. I love the place of the pulpit. However, I've discovered in interims, and I've literally been consecutively doing interims for the last 10 years, that the preaching is less informed in an interim. I feel like that being a pastor, you have the privilege of being with people in all of their complexities. Pastoral care, committees, the Wednesday night engagement. Those are the multiple ways in which you have touch points, and as well as the entrance you have in their lives to be the both good and the bad. That always informed, I felt like, the moment of the pulpit. And I miss the pastoral care parts of being a pastor very much. I don't know many pastors that say I really feel fulfilled in the administration. And ironically, that's all I do now. I do way more administration than I've ever done in my life. The pastorate helped inform that. There's no question about that. I've often said if you can pastor a church, you can rule the world if you want to, but I have to be honest and say I don't miss that at all. I don't miss always having to read the subtext of people's lives that are freighted with agendas. However, Danny, that's true everywhere. I mean, it's true in a university setting, in a seminary context. It's just one of those truisms. So yeah, that's probably a quick one. I can unpack anything you want, but yeah.
No, no, that's fine. I appreciate that. And that's kind of a segue because you are in a unique position. I've got a question too about the academy and the church I'm going to get
Yeah.
to in a second. But obviously, you probably don't have to say this. It's been a while since I've been in the seminary. I had a liberal arts education, then I went to seminary in New Orleans with my master's and my doctoral work. But Greg, who is attending theological school
Yeah,
these
yeah.
days, as far as maybe an age or a gender composition or even a racial demographic?
Well, the word on everybody's mind for a long while now is the how diversified theological students are. Let me say that a little bit differently. How diversified the student body is, not simply at the School of Theology here at Mercer, but I think across the landscape in North America. And diversity is no one thing. It's not monolithic. It's not like here in the Deep South, we often think of diversity as a white, black, or maybe male, female. But in reality, it's far more complex. Diversity is far more diverse. You do have, again, in the Deep South, the large groups are going to be African American, white, some Latino, Latina, Asian, and other. But it's age. I think that's a diversity demographic that we're really getting our heads around. So students are older. And by older, I don't mean they're in their late 20s. I mean they're in their 30s, 40s. There are second career, encore career students. This past year, I think we had someone that was born the oldest student or the youngest student was born in 2000, and the youngest student was born in the oldest student was born in 1950. That's a gap right there, and it's incredible. I think it really informs a classroom. We've got a student about to graduate who is a retired chemistry professor from another university. We have a physicist that is retired who's auditing classes. That really informs the classroom, but it works both ways. They're learning too from younger students and students who maybe of a different ethnicity than they are. So you're seeing all of this happening in the classroom. I think it makes for not just an enriched classroom experience, but you go back to your context, whatever that might look like, and you're informing it in a better way. Now, getting back to that comment you had made, students are coming both from traditional, healthy church contexts, but some are coming with church hurt, which is kind of interesting. So they're coming to a place that prepares persons for ministry, but they are dealing with their wounds. And so there's a little bit of self-care there, Danny. I think we all went to seminary too with our own sense, a little bit of baggage that we're trying to work out, thinking, well, I'm going to do better than previous generations, not realizing that we're also part of systems that we have to kind of better understand to work within. So, there's a lot of energy and it's all over. I'm not at all prepared to say it's any one thing. It's multiple things. And I think that watching both students, faculty, staff evolve in the journey is been the most enriching decade of my life, without comparison.
Well, one of the things, thinking about my own life, and maybe true with you, is this discussion of the call, of being called to ministry. You've been in the church, and now you are in the theological world, the academy. What kind of advice, when you have conversations with students, and you mentioned the different ages, what kind of advice would you give to a student who is sensing a call to ministry? And Greg, that doesn't necessarily mean to a church. It could be, right?
No, it's very good. I think, Danny, you hit the nail on the head because calling is foundational. I think that part of the theological education is to help in that formation piece, that vocational formation piece, so that they're understanding a little bit more about how to use a well-worn line from Howard Thurman, how is one being summoned, what God is calling them to do, realizing that the particularities of that may be very different and change. So I look at my own sense of calling as the same. I mean, it's growing, of course, I hope, maturing, but the context of my calling continues to change. So, served churches for about 30 years, continue in a different capacity, working here in higher ed, but I'm no my calling is not any doesn't have any one context but multiple. And for about a year after my pastorate and before coming to Mercer, I worked in nonprofit world working with adults with developmental disabilities, a work that I very much loved, but I felt like that I was honoring my calling. We have a 1 year block that every student has to go through vocational formation so that they're spending time reflecting on how is God calling me and how do I understand that and how do I articulate that? Because the point is not to stay in theology school, but one day they'll be launched. And so how do they? That's another thing, Danny, is that many of them are already in ministry. I would actually say most of them are in ministry. And so some of this is they're not going anywhere. They're already serving in very viable ways. It's just better informing their place of service.
Well, along those lines, and I had a little bit of a taste of this when I was just finishing my education and I taught extension classes, and I think online classes were kind of rolling out. Of course, this is old news, but do you find that has been a shift over the years between the in the classroom dynamic and then the online dynamic? I guess that's just the way it is. A lot of these students, they don't have to leave where they are to get a theological education.
Yeah, 100%. And we're no different than really anywhere else. We have online classes, we have residential classes or in-person classes, and we also teach both. Learning, they call it, so for example, I teach a course called Death and Dying, and I have a class that is students that are in the classroom, but also we have students that are zooming in and participating fully, and so we've got it set up with appropriate technology because, to your point, is that it's decentralizing theological education in the sense that it's no longer about y'all come and we do the work and then we send you out, but rather how do we provide theological education wherever you might be. And everybody has opinions about online education. There are absolutely, there's good about it, there are challenges about it, but I've observed when it's done correctly and well, it can be a thoroughgoing way of helping students prepare for their calling and inform their calling into ministry.
Well, like I said, that's different. I guess I'm a dinosaur when it comes to some of this, but a lot of these students are on the field already, serving. I was curious, though, in some of the reading that I've done, and I'm sure you have too. Would you say that there would be more, and this goes back to being church hurt and then still wanting to be involved. Do you find that there are more students or ministers who are looking to serve in churches, or would you find that there are more churches who are looking for ministers? Is there like a clergy shortage is what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I do think ultimately there probably is a growing clergy shortage. I know that will differ denominationally. And in particular, well, it's probably all the way around. Let me kind of just respond a little bit by just our own context. Increasingly, or let me say, in olden days, however we define that, in olden days.
I'm glad you used that term. I was going to use it later, Greg. Thank you for
Yeah,
working that in.
I'm there. You'd have students that were in seminary, ours or anywhere else, and churches would come to us and say, okay, we need interns, we need part-time, or we need people that are right out of the gate and ready to go. And so you kind of had a feeder system to churches. But now, increasingly, students are already engaged somewhere. And so there's very much not as many to provide internships with because they're already doing work. So I can't send them to, say, your church because they're already engaged in their church. The other thing that is you're seeing much more, the word is bivocational, some say polyvocational. The gig economy, that's a word we hear a lot. Well, particularly our younger students, they're already used to doing 5 different things. They're hustling and doing multiple things to make it work. They would like the full-time salaries and benefit kind of experience, but there's a shortage of those too. And so, and some will quite frankly, make more money with some of their other work so that they can support their smaller congregations or whatever that they might be doing that's their ministry.
That's probably going to be a change as we look ahead to what the church is going to look like.
Hmm.
I was curious with the curriculum that you have there. Do you find, would I resonate with some of this, like you still teach the biblical languages and theology and history? Would there be any new type of curriculum that would be more related to this generation of students coming through that with the changing culture and the dynamic of the church?
Yeah, yeah. Well, on the one hand, you still have to teach the foundations, right? So, New Testament, Old Testament, theology, philosophy, languages. We still require languages, and so forth. So in some respects, it's kind of the same, but in other ways, it's very different because um, I'll just speak for me. I went to Southern Seminary in the late 80s. Most of the authors were white Europeans or European descent, and some of the classical names that you and I both probably cut our teeth on, and so forth. Now you have scholarships that are Latin America, you have womanist theology, feminist theology, just a real diverse blend, which as I've looked at it, I'm thinking, well, this would have been very helpful for me to have learned even different voices because even though I went on to serve congregations that were primarily white, primarily Protestant, in my case in the Deep South, when you're stretched to look through the lenses of others, I think it actually deepens empathy. It deepens or cultivates a sense of looking at things through multiple lenses and therefore appreciation. So yes, now there's also some technical pieces that every generation has to continue to grow in. Students are teaching us about technology. I mean, we're trying to.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
that's one case. AI is nobody has a full handle on that, but it is clearly the native language of younger generations. And so while we look at it cautiously, I think culturally speaking, we look at it with appropriate caution. We nevertheless is something we must understand and bring an ethical lens to. And how can AI be a tool and not a substitute? So we're even in the School of Theology, we're trying to say, okay, well, what is this is going to be of use as we move forward?
Well, you mentioned it since you raised the issue of AI. So I'm hearing you say for us pastors out there that you wouldn't recommend going to ChatGPT or AI. I mean, you could say, give me a sermon on X and include this, and then you could have it in like 5 or 10 minutes. So I guess it's okay to be a tool, but this generation, it's going to be part of their vernacular, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. But gosh, I'm not a futurist, Danny, but there's no question. And so we're really trying to help understand in real time, right? What does this look like? The Gregory Jones, the president of Belmont University, we recently had him on campus in a lecture series, and I don't remember where he was making this quote, but he talked about the span between the agricultural generation and industrial generation is some 70 years. And then between the industrial generation and informational generation is 20 years. And between informational generation and artificial intelligence is 2 years. Because his point being is that we are moving so rapidly, we don't really know, we can't psychologically and academically get our heads around this. However, it's all around us. Now, going back to your initial analogy of AI in the sermon, we still have to remind ourselves the church needs our voice. They don't need someone or something else's voice any more than back in our day, Danny. You don't quote or rather you don't have a commentary substituting you speaking on behalf of the church. Commentary becomes, or the scholar or whatever is the tool, but it's not to substitute your voice because you know your context better than anyone. Therefore, as the proclaimer, you bring that there. So utilizing these as tools and not substitutes.
We've been talking a little bit about, there's certain competencies that we have to have when you serve in the church or in ministry in general. I think it was 2 years ago, and I'm mindful that this is we're recording this during Lent, and this is March. 6 years ago was when COVID came upon the scene, and it just no one really knew what to do with it. And Alexander Lang came out with this blog entry 2 years ago called Departure, Why I Left the Church. And he was a Presbyterian pastor, and he was more or less documenting why he was leaving, I guess, his church or the church in general. And where I'm going with this is that he said, I have become part of the great pastor resignation. And several years ago, Barna said 42% of pastors had considered quitting. I think that's gotten a little bit better now. But Alex mentioned these reasons, and they're not surprising to us. He said he quit because of immense stress of the job, feeling lonely and isolated, political divisions, adverse effect on the family, and not being optimistic about the future of the church. It's like the greatest hits of challenges that we have heard about this and talked about it. What do you make of this dynamic,
Yeah.
and what kind of skills do pastors need? Is it harder to be a pastor these days?
Yeah, I remember reading that article and feeling, kind of it resonating a bit, uncomfortably resonating a bit. And there's a few things that really kind of popped out to me both then and still is true. And this is somewhat confessional, but I think the loneliness behind the pulpit is intense. It's just intense. And it's a strange kind of loneliness, because even if one is married and has a very healthy relationship, part of the health of that relationship is you can't bring to your spouse all of the alienation that you might be feeling, and neither are they going to fully understand. They may see you struggling with that and empathize, but not necessarily understand. So it's a very lonely place for many reasons, including the ones mentioned here. I think others try to talk more candidly about that, about how are you taking self-care is a kind of an overused term, but how do you circle yourself with persons that you can trust and grow in? I talk very passionately about the need for having an ongoing spiritual director or therapist. About 20 years ago, I recognized I was so angry, and that's the word. I was just angry with members, angry with family members, and part of that anger was trying to fix everybody, because that's what you do as a pastor. At least that's what you think you're doing. And then realizing I can't fix anybody. I can only work on me. And so talking about how do you help circle back with that. And I will tell you, Danny, it's a lot easier for me to have friends not as a senior pastor, because I served, essentially historic churches where even if people weren't in my church, I'm kind of perceived as a pastor or their pastor. And I found it very lonely. It's a lot easier not in the pastorate to make friends. The other thing, and I'm throwing a lot at you, but
No, that's fine.
the thing that I think is so difficult today, and that what I just said is probably not new, I suspect, but what intensifies everything is today's technologies. So social media is just something that I think is nothing short of oppressive. And I'm not anti-social media, but I have a love-hate relationship with it. It's just, and then I do remember when email became mainstream. In other words, it was just everybody then was finally getting email, and people would write things that they would ordinarily not have a conversation with you about. That they wouldn't have a face-to-face conversation with things that they would put there and send to you. And so the visibility and vulnerability of criticism is much higher with today's technologies than ever before. Yeah.
Along those lines, and this is for both of us, we don't have a firsthand experience with this, but our church, we support men and women serving on staff and as deacons. And you were talking about the challenges of being in the ministry. Just from your unique perspective, as you talk to women perhaps that are already in the ministry or serving as pastors, are you finding churches more receptive to this? And do you find that maybe women have more difficulty or challenges as it relates to friends in the ministry or getting opportunities to serve?
Yeah. You had kind of warned me about this question, and yeah, my knee-jerk reaction is probably still the same one. I think churches are prepared to talk about. They are open to women in ministry, but I think they are less inclined to actually support it on staff. Now, many churches do have ordained women on staff for sure, but particularly in the senior pastorate, a lot of women really do feel called to serve as senior pastors. Now, I recognize your listeners may not all support that. I'm not weighing in, but many women do feel called, and churches will say on paper, we support women in ministry. Gender is not a decisive factor for filling such and such position, but the proof is in the pudding, and it often is a deciding factor, which can be frustrating for our female students who are wanting to serve. And what's ironic is that not too many decades ago, that if a woman wanted to serve congregationally, it was most often going to need to be either as a children's minister, maybe a student minister, or perhaps a minister of music. Well, now, because there's a theological affirmation of serving, yes, also as a pastor, have fewer and fewer women wanting to even be a children's minister. So there's that. And so there's so many things at play here that congregations, they're not persons called in ministry are in their discernment period.
Saying one thing is not the same as actually following through and doing it. Greg, I came across an interesting article this past week. It was written by Braxton Wade from Baptist News Global, our friends over there, and it was called When the Church Confuses Vocation with Calling. And to distill what he's talking about, he was saying that as he was talking to pastors and ministers, and this relates to the discouragement factor in the ministry, once you have an idea of what it's like and then you get into it and it turns out to be something else. He said he had talked to pastors and asked them something pretty insightful. He said, would pastors attend the churches they are currently serving if they were not employed to be there? And he got some surprising results. You probably can infer from that what that would be. How do you unpack a question like that?
Yeah, I can remember as a pastor even having these conversations with my own staff. You know, is this a worship service you would want to go to, or is this a fellowship that you'd want to align with? And so, I mean, a couple of things come to mind is, and I'm going to just kind of go back to my current context. It is imperative that with students, you have as robust as possible contextual education process, getting them in a context and having them learn and reflect. And I'll say more often than not, that tends to be a very healthy time where students are realizing, I had no idea what went on in preparing a budget, or even what a budget was. I mean, things that are kind of mundane if you do this for a living, but for them it can be eye-opening. Or I had no idea that it takes this many groups to actually execute a type of ministry, and they can say that in the affirmative. That's a great thing to see so many people involved, realizing the complexity, that it's not as simple as, I don't know, standing behind a pulpit and saying we're going to do X, Y, Z and do these type of things. So having a robust contextual education is at least one way to help better prepare from the academic journey to the practical, and also offering appropriate electives to help in that specific piece. I teach death and dying because after several years, we're hearing from alumni who are out there in the work, and you know this, Danny, yourself. They're realizing, I don't know if I'm prepared to handle people that are dying. And come to find out, everybody dies. And I have funerals, and what do I do? And so that's believe it or not, it's been a fun class to teach. The probably the more subjective point, though, is, well, what do you make of, is this a church where I'd want to attend? I don't quite know how to answer that, because I'm not sure if I've ever been in a church that I've actually was everything I wanted. You know, some of it is you try to create or lead in a way that you feel like is authentic and has integrity. But the other is in ministry, we're called to companion. I mean, we're called to walk alongside people, and that takes on a different kind of cloaking or clothing. We're not, I'm going to be careful here, because I'll think about this later and be dead wrong. In a healthy marriage, we're not asking our spouse to be like us. Now, you and I know that can functionally happen. We expect our spouse to be just like us. But we're in marriage because there's healthy differences and we resonate. And yes, as we grow older together, there's a lot of overlap. I think it's not unlike in a congregational setting, is that we're loving alongside people in their liturgy as we celebrate our relationship with God, in our ministries as we try to serve in ways that are just and good to our communities, in our rituals, and so forth. All I can say is that I've never been in a congregation where it was exactly like I wanted to be, but I felt validated when I thought I could walk alongside and not so much ask people to make the changes I wanted to see, but maybe to live alongside with them. Now, that can be a cop-out too. That could be an airbrush over flaws and shortcomings, for sure.
No, that's fine. And here's going to be another one that's probably going to feel the same way about Greg, but Ryan Burge seems to be this guy that is doing a lot of writing about statistics, and he wrote a book called The Vanishing Church: How the Hollowing Out of Moderate Congregations is Hurting Democracy, Faith in Us. And full disclosure, I haven't read that because I'm still working on some of these other books I
Yeah.
got. And John Meacham is my recent guy. But Ryan was talking about the polarization that we seem to be going through with our politics, regardless of what those are. But don't you think the church, what kind of role does the church need to have? It seems like the church could be one of the few places left that there could be people coming together that don't have the same political views. And one of the expressions I heard was that people will not leave their politics for their church, but they might leave their church for their politics. How would you guide, or
Yeah.
do these students coming into it and about to get out, do they know what they're about to get into?
Well, it gets talked about a lot. And some of it's talked about in the classroom because part of our diversity is we also have people that have very different theological bedrock beliefs or at least experiences, and some of that translates politically. So it's you'll have in a classroom, you may have someone that voted on different sides of the aisle, so to speak. So there's a little bit of modeling in the classroom, although I don't want to overstate that either. I'm not sure I can answer that, Danny. I'm not sure if any of us are fully prepared for that.
No, I think that's fine because I guess to have it discussed, I think is a huge step forward because sometimes we're not even able to talk about
I hope
certain
it gets
things.
named behind pulpits. I'm sure you do, and I try to note that because I do remember even before these recent years, not so many years ago, that there are times I had to watch how I would phrase something because it would be perceived in a political fashion. I'm thinking I didn't mean it like that at all, but that's how
Right.
it's being heard. Yeah.
I want to kind of shift to more of a positive front because when you talk about the church and then you're training ministers in the educational field, you could talk about clergy burnout, you could talk about clergy misconduct, and then all the metrics that we use. But when you look at the church, what gives you hope?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that gives me great hope is what the church has always been. I I think I'm saying this accurately. It's the only place people can go to from birth to death where there's at least a professed covenant to walk alongside. And I think that as we are in a culture that is increasingly lonely, there's a lot of statistics out there about loneliness and social isolation, that the church, I think, does provide the solution. And believe it or not, I don't mean that in a very specific, narrow way. I think congregationally, if we can discover how we can open the door even wider, this gives me hope as churches figure out how that will look. I do think there is continued pruning down. Congregations are getting smaller. They are real estate heavy, and so they're figuring out what do we do with that. And some have healthy options to that. Others, it's a little more dire. But there is also, we're in the season of spring, it's Lent. So
Right.
part of Lent is, agriculturally speaking, is prepping the dead so that it's ready to give birth to some life. And so I'm not sure I'll live to see that fully, and I'm also okay with that. So right now I'll just be faithful in my small part of that. But I think it will open up to something far more generous. And I hope that my hope is that if church can remember that it's not intended to be entangled with some power structure, politically or otherwise, but rather its own witness in whom we follow, there's some integrity there.
I'm going to try to get you out of here on one or two more. But you alluded to there's just so much. The glass is half full or it could be half empty.
Yeah, yeah.
But the hope of the church will continue. When you think about the course of your life and where you started and where you are now, if you knew then what you know now, what might you have said to your younger self
Yeah, yeah.
getting started?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not one of these. This sounds schmaltzy, but I've been very grateful of the path I've had. There's a lot of things I wouldn't go and do it again, but not because it was bad. It's just
Yeah,
that okay, I've
yeah,
had that experience. And that includes churches. I mean, I've served some great churches using providential language. There's some churches I thought, well, boy, that was a tough time, but it really prepared me well for future parts. So I think, part of this is that sense of providence. But I'm not answering the question because I am just, I would use the word grateful. I grew up, Danny, I grew up on a dairy farm, generational dairy farmers, and personally, farmed alongside my dad and all of that. And that's hard. I mean, physically hard, demanding work. And but there's actually some comparisons to it. There's a type of stewardship that you're given, and the successes are very marginal. It's almost like survival. And I think the pastorate and ministry in general is really a matter of stewardship, and that you have seasons that are difficult and you have seasons that are flourishing, and you really keep an eye on the larger thing, and through it all just simply being grateful. And I feel very privileged, very, very privileged. I had no idea I'd be working in higher ed. That's been a lot of fun, but being in higher ed is also reminding me I'm glad I didn't have a career in higher ed. I don't think that would have been fulfilling. So I'm kind of glad in my encore life to have this season, but yeah.
Some of the things that we're doing now may not have been right for us early on.
100%.
Yeah. I want to get you out of here on this one. I want to quote you to you because I was reading John Claypool you mentioned Death, Loss, and Grief, and his book Tracks of a Fellow Struggler is one that I've used a lot. And I remember reading one of your blog entries, I think it was June of last year, savor the ordinary as the extraordinary because each day is a gift. And I think I'm hearing you say that. Do you find that that's kind of been the way you've tried to approach life and would encourage others to approach life?
Well, yes. Doesn't mean I've been successful at that, Danny, but I do try to remind myself of that and this goodness of the moment. And that's, Lord knows that's not original. Let's just pick your favorite spiritualist, Richard Rohr, or I mean, we could go on, but even sitting in Atlanta traffic, I had to remind myself of that yesterday in utter frustration in a shutdown on 400 southbound, and just thinking, take a breath. This may be indeed your only moment, and so you might as well live into that moment as fully as you absolutely can.
I'll let you do that instead of me. I'd rather take the traffic I've got than yours.
Oh, gracious. It does try the spirit.
Yeah. Any final thoughts before we part ways?
Yeah, tell me about how you came about Elisha's Bears.
Okay. The short answer is that it was there. All right. But the Elisha's Bears, of course, when we get a certain age, I commiserate with the story because of Elisha being the prophet, and then the boys mocked him for being bald-headed. And I share that characterization too. And I was trying to think of a good how to go with this. And I thought, it's like choosing a dissertation topic. You have to pick something no one has. And I thought, this is probably one that's out there. So I got it and I found it kind of indicative to me. And I like the idea of the bears. This sounds kind of horrible, but the bears coming down.
Oh, I know the story well.
Exacting vengeance on these kids for mocking him. So it's more related to my own situation, but I just like that story.
It's a word of warning. Nobody needs to criticize your podcast.
That's what I'm going to quote you on. And when I start promoting it, I'm going to use you in your endorsement.
Yes, the she-bears will get you.
That's exactly right. And I had there's a minister on our staff who's good about sketching things and putting things together, and I thought it was kind of a humorous.
I like it.
Thing to do, yeah. But Greg, I'm so grateful to have you with me today. For our listeners, we've been privileged to be with Dr. Greg Deloach, who is the Dean of the Mercer School of Theology. I'd encourage you to follow the podcast if you're not doing that already. And until next time, you take care.